I'm Ray. Welcome if you're new here, welcome back if you've been here before. This should be a fairly quick video. I read 4 books in the month of March, which I feel like in my pre-booktube days would have been a good reading month, but is now on the lesser side of what I get through in a month. March was a really busy and stressful month, so I'm actually super happy that I kept up with my kind of baseline of 1 book a week that I try and follow. So without further ado, let's whiz our way through what I read in March. Okay, the first thing that I read in March, and I have not talked about this anywhere yet, so I can dedicate a little bit more time to this book, which I feel that it needs because I have a lot of thoughts and not all of them happy thoughts. This was The Making of a Marchioness by Frances Hodgeson Burnett. A little bit of background if you're new here. Frances Hodgeson Burnett is one of my favourite children's authors of all time. She wrote The Secret Garden and A Little Princess. They are 2 of my favourite books, just favourite books, not even favourite children's books. I adore them, they are perfection. And this, her adults novel, is published by Persephone Classics. I also love and adore Persephone Classics. They are a publisher that I really trust, and I generally am confident that anything that I pick up by them I'm going to enjoy. They publish mainly underrepresented female writers from the early 20th century. So, I went into this with really high expectations. I listened to it on audiobook and I was a bit confused when I put this into my Goodreads because it came up as being The Making of a Marchioness parts 1 and 2. So I was like, okay, that's interesting. I thought it was just 1 novel, but it's kind of 2 books in 1. And it is very much 2 books in 1. And my experience with each separate book was very different. So this book follows the main character, Emily Fox Seton, who comes from upper class blood. However, after their family lost all their money, she is now in, I believe, kind of Edwardian England sort of times, working for her keep in London. She is a lovely character. She sees the joy and the beauty in everything. She is represented as somebody who isn't necessarily deep thinking, isn't really an intellectual, but is just a really pure, kind and good human being. She gets invited by her friend, this incredibly stuck-up, well-to-do woman who kind of wants her to be a bit of a skivvy and knows that she's a very helpful, well-meaning and kind person. She gets invited to this friend's party during the summer, and there is a nobleman who is a widower and is kind of looking for a replacement wife, / all of the single women there certainly think that he is, and it's about his choosing a marchioness. That is book 1. It was everything that I hoped it would be. Honestly, I loved it. It was just so warm, it was so funny, it was so comforting, it was so beautiful, it was so calm, it was everything that I look for in a comfort novel. It was really nicely written. I was super fond of Emily. You knew where the plot was going to go from the beginning. There were no qualms about that, but the journey along the way was beautiful. Part 2 then becomes something completely and utterly different. It kind of becomes a thriller. And the change in genre didn't really, in my opinion, work. It's very weird. Emily Fox Seton suddenly ends up surrounded by people who very much do not have her best interests at heart, and there's this kind of battle between her own good nature and goodwill and the threat of the people around her. Part 2 fell down because some of the characterizations were just really painful to read. So for example, there's a couple of Indian characters in it, an Indian servant in particular, and I think when you're reading older books, obviously you know that attitudes have changed and that in this sense, even writing by authors we love, can age badly, and you can have these bits in the novels which kind of make you cringe whilst you still admire the overall writing. But what I really disliked in this book was that it didn't feel even just like, oh, this is a product of the time. It just felt like bad and lazy writing from Burnett. So very disappointed by that. Also, massive disappointment was her own attitude towards Emily was really misogynistic, and it honestly just breaks my heart when you see authors who have such internalized misogyny from the period infiltrating into their writing. And you get this, for example, like in the Anne of Green Gables series. I feel it really strongly when you get on to Anne's House of Dreams and beyond. You get it in Louisa May Alcott's Little Women series as well. You have these female writers who are clearly incredibly intelligent, incredibly talented, and yet they feel the need in their writing to do down the female characters and do up the male characters in order to align with society's expectations at the time in which they were writing. And the way that Burnett does this in The Making of a Marchioness is by becoming really critical of Emily in a way that just feels completely unnecessary. So she's regularly compared to a farm animal for her docility. We're also just consistently told that she's stupid and that she's not clever, even though none of her actions ever actually demonstrate to us that she's stupid or not clever. In fact, she comes across as a very kind, very good, very warm-hearted woman who is also not an idiot. Sometimes characters can almost kind of outwile their authors, if you know what I mean, as in you can be told explicitly something about a character by the author, but the character is just like better than that, and you know that what the author said is not true. So that was my view on Emily. The second half just really dragged it down, and I think I gave it 3.5 stars overall, which was kind of my balancing out of about a 4.5 stars for the first part of the book, which I adored, and then probably like a 2 stars for the second part of the book. I was still like very much looking forward to listening to the story. I was listening to it in the car at the end of work every day, and that routine was lovely. And sometimes when I get into my car at the end of work now, I still have that little moment where I'm like, oh good, it's the making of Marchioness, and then I remember that I finished it like over a month ago. So it was obviously an enjoyable reading experience, but if you are a lover of Frances Hodgson Burnett, be prepared that this is not up to her other books. And if you've never read anything by Burnett before, please don't start here. I saw someone on Goodreads had written a review saying this was the first thing they'd read by her and they thought it was awful, and I totally understand that. This is not the place to start. Okay, the next book that I finished is The Mother of the Brontës, When Maria Met Patrick by Sharon Wright. This was for the Fierce Women book club. I gave quite a lot of my thoughts on this directly after I finished it in my travelling reading vlog. I'll link it in the cards. So to summarise what I said there, I basically enjoyed it. It kind of made me question how much I love biography as a genre, because I sometimes feel like you don't get enough depth exploration into the inner world of the character, and I kind of felt like that was the case with Maria at certain particularly kind of crux points in her life when there wasn't really very much evidence. I think I would really enjoy like a fictionalized version of Maria's life. However, I learned loads of social history about the Georgian era, which I didn't know at all. I just found that completely fascinating, and I also obviously learned all about the life of the mother of the Brontës, which feels so good to know about because I love the Brontës. I love all of their writing. I find their life history fascinating. Who doesn't? Like, it is fascinating. But the mother of the figure, who is just a total blank, she died when the children were still very young, therefore she didn't really play much of a role in their upbringing. However, she obviously was their mother, and I think as a society we've kind of just blanked her out because she was a woman. There wasn't very much of her history kind of saved for the world. But Wright has done an excellent job of doing a ton of research to find out about what her life was like, and also particularly to share some of the writing that remains from her, exclusively a bundle of love letters that she wrote to Patrick while they were courting, and a Christian religious tract that she wrote for a magazine. Things that I don't think that I said before. It was kind of a positive and a negative, just how much Wright clearly adored her subject. I wanted to give her the moment in the limelight that she hadn't previously had. I love the sense that Wright was kind of fighting for Maria and was on Maria's side, but something that Milena mentioned in her review, I'll link the 3 hosts review videos down below, is that sometimes it kind of felt like Wright was fighting too hard to make Maria a likeable character, particularly Milena mentioned in terms of talking about her physical health being really strong, even though there are sources from the time that suggest that she was delicate, i.e. that she wasn't necessarily in bounding good health and physical energy for all of her life. I would add to this, there are a couple of points again where Wright just kind of directly defies a source purely for the point of buoying up Maria, even though it kind of seems unnecessary. So like in Gaskell's biography of Charlotte Brontë, which I know is flawed, but anyway, in Gaskell's biography of Charlotte Brontë, I believe she describes Maria as unattractive, and Wright comes back and says, attractiveness is so subjective that we can't know whether she was attractive or unattractive. However, the thing that people most remembered about her was her sense of good taste. And it just kind of feels a little bit like she's fighting for us to like Maria a bit too hard, because like, yes, attractiveness is subjective, but also we do have societal standards of beauty, and presumably Gaskell was referring to that time's societal standards of beauty, and that gives us an idea about the fact that Maria wasn't renowned for being a beauty. Fair enough, neither were the Brontë children. We could still feel fondly towards Maria if she had not been beautiful and if she had not been strong. That doesn't prevent somebody from being a likeable person. Similarly, this religious tract that Maria wrote was quite abhorrent. It basically said that the poor should be glad to be poor because it means that there are fewer distractions between them and the Lord. And obviously this is just a super privileged thing to write. You know, this is referring to people who are in extreme poverty, who are really suffering, who didn't know where their next meal was coming from. This is coming from a lady who grew up in wealth and privilege in Cornwall and who is living a fairly comfortable middle-class life. But Wright just kind of skims over this and says these are the views of the time, and doesn't necessarily explore the fact that perhaps some of Maria's perspectives were a little bit problematic. Again, that's okay, she was human. So that was one slight flaw with it. My other very tiny issue with it is actually just the subtitle, When Maria Met Patrick, because Wright's whole aim with this book is to give Maria, the mother of the Brontës, the opportunity to stand on her own 2 feet as an important figure in her own right, and yet the only way that she felt that she was able, or the only way that the publishers felt that they were able to sell the story, was by turning it into a romance between her and Patrick. And that just seemed really sad. Overall, I think I gave it 3.5 stars. I found it really interesting. It just blew my mind how much the world has changed in 200 years. Like, Maria came from a family of, I think, approximately 12 children, where over 50% of the children died in infancy, and the parents used to like have a child and then it died, and then if they had another baby that was the same sex, they would call it the same name, and then if that child died and they had a third baby, they like didn't have the heart to call it the same name a third time in a row. And that is just mind-blowingly heartbreaking. And these were people who were upper middle class at the time. This was not people living in poverty. Travelling around the country was an extremely arduous process. Going from Penzance, where she grew up, to Yorkshire was like an immense undertaking of a journey equivalent to going to Australia or beyond, to be honest, nowadays. And Maria was never able to travel back to her hometown. The journey was really dangerous because of highwaymen. Her possessions had to come by boat, but then the boats were quite often shipwrecked and people would lose all of their worldly belongings. It's just like insane to me how much the world has changed in 200 years, and I found it really enjoyable and really fascinating to learn more about the social history. Like, social history is always the most interesting sort of history, I think. What people's day-to-day lives were actually like, that's kind of what you want to know, and this book did a wonderful job of doing that. Also did a wonderful job of bringing Maria Brontë to life in her own right. So thank you to the Fierce Women Book Club for picking that book for January and February, even though I didn't get around to finishing it until March. Penultimate novel that I read was Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. This is a classic work from the Roman time period, written by Emperor Marcus Aurelius. These were his private personal meditations, kind of reflections that he wrote in a diary, never intended to be published, looking at how to live a good life and how to die a good death. I listened to these on audiobook. Do not recommend listening to them on audiobook. It doesn't work at all, and I'm speaking as a lover of audiobooks. I consume and always have consumed a lot of my literature on audiobook, but this just like was really hard to follow as an audiobook. Definitely read it hard copy if you possibly can. He has a very stoical attitude to life. You know, basically don't compare yourself to others, don't worry too much about striving for success. It kind of a little bit irks me when people who have achieved the highest levels of success claim that success isn't worth aiming for. It's like when people who are rich say that money doesn't matter. But mostly what irked me about this book was that Aurelius is clearly an old man who's getting close to death, and he kind of seems to be spending the novel reassuring himself that he's going to die, everybody dies, don't worry too much about your connection to the world, don't care too much for worldly things because death is coming for us all. And it's just incredibly repetitive. It just feels like every other line he loops back to this way of thinking, and I kind of started to find it a bit boring. So was not a huge fan of this. I actually talked about it a bit more in my travelling vlog, which is linked in the cards. I don't want to just repeat myself because I don't have too much more to say about it. Didn't pay attention to it that closely, and I didn't love it that much. Finally, we have A Song of Rose and Ruin by Roseanne A. Brown. This is a YA fantasy book. It came out last year. YA fantasy is not my usual genre, but this was a really fun read for me, I think largely because of that fact. It's set in this fantasy world during this festival called Solstasia, which is a huge turn-of-the-century-esque festival that happens only once every 50 years. It's obviously a once-in-a-lifetime event for everybody, but as the novel unfolds, we also see that it plays an extremely important role in maintaining the world the way that it is. In this book, there are two main characters, and the narrative alternates between their two stories. We have Malik, who is a refugee with his two sisters. And then we have Karina, who is a princess. They each very much have their own issues that they're struggling to live with. So Malik suffers from crippling anxiety and panic attacks, not to mention obviously his traumatic personal circumstances of being a refugee, coming from a part of the country that is very much looked down upon by everybody else around him. Karina suffers from crippling migraines. That was one of the things that drew me to this book. That alongside the fact that it draws off West African mythology, and she has her own grief from within her childhood that she is trying to cope with and come to terms with. We then end up with a series of challenges that Malik has to go through, and obviously Malik and Karina kind of meet. It's partly about their relationship and largely about both of the characters trying to kind of solve the issues that are going on within their own lives that pertain both to themselves but also to the wider world around them. There's a load of magic thrown in, there's some sort of mythical characters, mythical creatures. It was a really riveting read. It was like one of those books where every chapter ended on a cliffhanger and you just kind of had to keep reading to find out what happened next. I haven't read a book like that in a very long time and I really enjoyed it. I was kind of a bit sad because I really wanted to like Karina. She's the one who suffers from migraines, and as I also do, I thought that I would kind of feel a bond with her, but I actually found her unbelievably annoying. However, I was very fond of many of the other characters, also especially some of the side characters. I always think that's quite a nice feature in a book when side characters actually have value to you that's beyond just the role that they play in the story. There is the second book coming out next year, and it's going to be a duology, which I think is so perfect. Like, I feel like so often novelists make their books a trilogy if they have a story and they want to write more than one story about something, but then occasionally the trilogy can just feel a bit dragged out and overly long, like The Bear and the Nightingale, I'm Looking at You. Whereas this story kind of finishes just like perfectly set up for there to be another book, but still having been an entire narrative in and of itself. I'm really excited to see where Brown takes the next book. So that's it, that's my 4 novels from March. Let me know down in the comments if you've read any of these books, what your thoughts were on them, if you have any recommendations from great stuff that you read in March or April by the time you're watching this video. Thank you so very much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.